So 2010, C. McCarthy. So it's very important over here to look at what type of a business C. McCarthy is. So C. McCarthy is a motor dealer. So the trial balance of C. McCarthy, a motor dealer, failed to agree on the 31st of the 12th, 2009. The difference was entered in a suspense account and the following balance sheet was prepared. So on checking the books, the following errors were discovered. So number one, McCarthy sent a cheque for €620 in full settlement of a business debt of €660, and this was recorded correctly in the books. However, no entry had been made in the books of the subsequent dishonouring of this cheque and the payment on account of €300 cash by McCarthy. Number two, McCarthy had returned a motor car previously purchased on credit for €15,600 from a supplier. McCarthy entered this transaction as €16,500 on the correct sides of the correct accounts in the ledger. A credit note subsequently arrived from the supplier showing a transport charge of €600 to cover the cost of the return. The only entry made in respect of this credit note was a credit of $15,000 in the creditor's account. Number three, McCarthy won a motor vehicle valued at €30,000 in a draw. McCarthy gave this vehicle to the business and took an old vehicle from the business valued at €22,500, which was to be used for private purposes. The only entry made in the firm's books regarding both vehicles was a debit in the cash book of €22,500. Number four, cash payments of €450 for repairs to equipment had been credited to the creditor's account and also credited to the motor vehicles account. Number five, a cheque for €5,250 paid by McCarthy out of a private bank account for 15 months hire of diagnostic equipment up to the 31st of the 3rd, 2010 had not been entered into the books. Okay, so part A was 50 marks this year and it says journalise the necessary corrections. So looking at your errors there, take your red and green pen, and if you want to pause this video, start underlining what you think should have been recorded in green and what the mistakes were in red. Okay, so hopefully your work looks a bit like this. So as you can see, there's no underlining of the first sentence there because it says McCarthy sent a cheque for $620 in full settlement of a business debt of $660, and this was recorded correctly in the books, so we do not need to record that again. If we recorded that again, we would be making a mistake there. Okay, we'd be the ones making the mistake. So moving on then, what should have happened then? So the dishonouring of this cheque. So let's take a read of this again. So McCarthy sent a cheque for $620 in full settlement of a business debt of $660, and this was recorded correctly in the books. So McCarthy is our business. We're doing the books for McCarthy here. They sent a cheque for $620. Who did they send a cheque to? So they sent a cheque to their creditors. Okay, and that was in full settlement of a business debt of $660. So their debt to the creditor reduced by $660, but the cheque only left their bank account $620. So they must have received a discount of €40 there. So what would have happened when that cheque went out would have been $620 credit side, $620 credit side of the bank account, $660 debit side of the creditor, and €40 credit side of the discount account. So we unwind that cheque then by putting the figures on the opposite side. So we had put the $620 here, so now we're recording that it was dishonoured, so we're unwinding that, so that's $620 here in the bank account. Our creditor, we had put $660 here because our debt to them reduced. Creditor is a liability. When liability is reduced, we debit them. So we're unwinding that now and putting the $660 on the credit side of the creditor account. And we had recorded discount received, so that is a revenue. We had recorded that there. So we are unwinding that by putting it on the debit side of the discount account. Now you don't have to write all of this. You can just write discount account. That's absolutely fine here. So that is the recording of the check. And now we want to record the payment on account of 300 cash by McCarthy. So if we paid McCarthy 300 cash, we are going to debit 300 in the creditor account and we are going to credit 300 in the cash account. So that's what we're going to do there. So what happened by mistake was that nothing was entered there at all. And how will I fix it? Well, I'm simply just going to enter what should have happened. So into my journalizer, the entries then, I have bank 620 on the debit side, I have creditor 300 on the debit side and 660 on the credit side. In the discount account, I have €40 on the debit side, and in the cash account, I have €300 on the credit side. So what am I going to call this? So being recording of dishonoured check and payment on account of €300 cash to the creditor. Moving on then to number 2. So McCarthy had returned a motor car previously purchased on credit for 15,600 from a supplier. So this happened. So that needs to be recorded. McCarthy entered this transaction as 16,500 on the correct sides of the correct accounts in the ledger. That did not happen, so we're going to underline that red. A credit note subsequently arrived from the supplier showing a restocking charge of €600 to cover the cost of the return. That happened, so we're going to underline that green. And then the red there, the only entry made in respect of this credit note was a credit of 15,000 in the creditor's account. So what should have happened? So McCarthy had returned a motor car previously purchased on credit for 15,600 from a supplier. So we credit the purchase account because that is purchase returns, and we reduce the debt to the creditor, so we debit the creditor 15,600. That's the first green sentence there. Second green sentence says a credit note subsequently arrived from the supplier showing a transport charge of €600 to cover the cost of the return. So we simply put €600 on the opposite sides of those accounts. So overall, in our purchase account, we have 15,600 minus 600, so that is €15,000 on the credit side of the purchase account. In the creditor account, we have 15,600 minus 600, so that is 15,000 there as well. Now, what happened by mistake? So McCarthy entered this transaction as 16,500 on the correct sides of the correct accounts in the ledger. So it's just the wrong amount. So correct accounts, correct sides, but wrong amount. So 16,500 on the credit side of purchases and 16,500 on the debit side of the creditor. Now the second red sentence, the only entry made in respect of this credit note was a credit of 15,000 in the creditor's account. So we have a credit in the creditor's account there, €15,000. So 16,500 minus €15,000 is €1,500 debit side. So how will I fix this then? So in the purchase account, all I have is 15,000 on the credit side. Okay. What happened by mistake? I have 16,500 on the credit side of the purchase account. So what am I going to do to fix it? I am going to debit the purchase account €1,500 there on the debit side of the purchase account. So in the creditor account, I have 15,000 on the debit side of the creditor account. That's what I want, sorry, but what I have at the moment is 1,500. So I need to add 13,500 to the creditor account in order to get it up to be €15,000 there. Now, as you know, my debits and credits, when they don't equal, I need to create a suspense account. So in this scenario, I have 15,000 on the debit sides of those accounts, but I have absolutely nothing on the credit side. So I must create a suspense account there, 15,000 on the credit side. So that is number 2 done. So purchases 1,500 debit, creditors 13,500 debit, and suspense 15,000 credit. So being recording of purchase returns and credit note incorporating restocking charge. Okay, so number 3 then. McCarthy won a motor vehicle valued at 30,000 in a draw. Now, I didn't really need to underline that green, to be fair, because that's just information I'm going to use. So you could leave that blank there as well. So McCarthy gave this vehicle to the business and took an old vehicle from the business valued at 22,500, which is to be used for private purposes. So that should have been recorded, so that needs to be recorded in green then. The only entry made in the firm's books regarding both vehicles was a debit in the cash book of 22,500. So that happened by mistake. Okay, so when McCarthy gave a vehicle worth 30,000, so it was a private vehicle because he won it in a draw himself, okay, so he gave that to the business, so that would be capital 30,000. So we credit capital, okay. Now, that is going to be purchases. So why is it purchases and not motor vehicle? It's purchases because McCarthy is a motor vehicle, or is a garage dealer. So McCarthy sells motor vehicles. So when a sole trader gives something to the business that the business sells, it is purchases. Okay. Now, what did he do then? He took an old vehicle worth 22,500. All right. So we can debit the capital account, or you could debit the drawings account. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter what you do, and they allow for both of them there. So 22,500 could also go into the debit side of the drawings account, but we just throw in the debit side of the capital account. So it's kind of the same thing, taking capital out of the business. And so we also credit the purchases account of €22,500 there. So overall, 30,000 minus 22,500 is 7,500. And in the purchases account, we have 30,000 minus 22,500, and that is 7,500 on the debit side of the purchase account. So what happened by mistake? The only entry made in the firm's books regarding both vehicles was a debit in the cash book of €22,500. So what happened by mistake? €22,500 debit side of the bank account here. So how do we fix this? So capital, €7,500 credit, purchases, €7,500 debit, bank, we're going to undo this by putting 22,500 on the credit side of the bank, and then we're going to have to create a suspense account, 22,500 debit side of the suspense account, to get our debits and credits to equal. So that is number 3 complete. So enter that then into your part A, so enter your workings in. So capital 7,500 on the credit side, purchases 7,500 on the debit side, bank 22,500 on the credit side, and suspense 22,500 on the debit side. So being capital introduced in the form of a motor van and the cancellation of an incorrect entry in the bank account. So number 4, cash payments for €450 for repairs to equipment had been credited to the creditors account and also credited to the motor vehicles account. So cash payments for €450 for repairs to equipment. Okay, so what should have happened there? Cash, our asset cash, should decrease, so therefore we credit the cash account €450. And repairs to equipment, well, repairs are an expense, and you know from our alert diagram that we debit expense accounts. So the repairs is an expense, debit the repairs, 450 there. So what happened by mistake? That had been credited to the creditors account and also credited to the motor vehicles account. So they treated it as if it wasn't cash, that it was credit. So credit 450 here, and then it was also credited to the motor vehicles account. So that's completely wrong. So how will we fix this? We'll put the cash and the repairs in as they need to go in. To undo this here, we are going to debit the creditor account 450 and debit the motor vehicle account 450. So debit, and then we are going to suspense the €900 there. So cash 450 credit, repairs 450 debit, and creditors 450 debit. Then we have motor vehicles debit 450 and suspense €900 credit. So being cash payments for repairs credited in error to creditors and vehicles account. So that's number 4. Number 5, a cheque for $5,250 paid by McCarthy out of a private bank account for 15 months hire to diagnostic equipment up to the 31st of the 3rd 2010 had not been entered in the books. Okay, so what should have happened here? What should have happened is that capital was 5250. So he paid for a business expense out of his own private bank account. So 5250 is capital. All right. What was the expense? It was equipment, hire of equipment up to the 31st of the 3rd next year. So we're doing the accounts for 31st of the 12th, 2009. Okay, so that is going to be 15 months higher. So therefore, 12 months is going to be the current year, 2009, and then 3 months is going to be for next year, 2010. And that had not been entered in the books. So the capital account, 5250 on the credit side. Equipment hire for 12 months then in the TPL, 4,200 on the debit side. And then we have equipment hire in the balance sheet. We've got 3 months prepaid, 1,050. So think about this here. Equipment hire is an expense, we debit expenses. Equipment hire prepaid in the balance sheet is an asset, so we debit that asset there. So overall we've got 5250 on both sides. What happened by mistake was that nothing was entered, so we simply just enter what should have happened. So number 5, capital 5250 on the credit side. Equipment hire in the TPL, 4,200 on the debit side, and then equipment hire prepaid in the balance sheet, 1,050 on the debit side. So overall, that is being the private funds used to pay 12 months rent of equipment for this year and 3 months rent of equipment prepaid. So that is all of your journalized entries done. The next thing that you're asked to do is show the suspense account for 6 marks. So you just go down through your part A and you identify where you have entered a suspense account. So there have been 3 suspense entries there in error 2, 3 and 4. So we take these figures and we simply put them into the suspense account. So remember, there's only 6 marks going for this, so we do this really quickly. But what you have to do is write the number of the error that it came from and the details then. So what was the error in all of these 3? So in number 3 there, it was that you had put something into the cash book when you shouldn't have. Number 2 was your error with your purchases and creditor. And number 4 was your creditor. Okay, so number 4 was your creditor, or it could have been motor vehicles either. So you could say creditors or motor vehicles. Okay, so how do we finish this? Well, we look and see which is the biggest side. The debit side is the biggest side. So enter largest amount then on both sides, so 22,500 on both sides. And so do both sides now equal 22,500? No, they don't. So the debit side doesn't, but the credit side does. So then what we have to do is enter the difference into the credit side to make that side now equals 22,500 euro. So this is the original difference. So what does that mean? What's that all about? Well, earlier on in the balance sheet, when the total net assets and the capital employed did not balance, what the bookkeeper did was to put the mistakes into a suspense account for now, and they threw it in with the stock account. So the stock isn't actually worth 182,400. That is 182,400 with 6,600 on the credit side. So if we think about it, the balance brought down was 182,400, and that was what was put into the balance sheet. But the stock account had 6,600 euro on the credit side. Okay, so what was the stock really? Well, the stock really was then 189,000. So if we think about it, when we're doing our corrected balance sheet, we are going to add 6,600 back to stock then in the balance sheet. All right, part C then, 14 marks for us to prepare a statement showing the corrected net profit. So we go back to our part A and we identify all of those items that belong in the trading profit and loss. So what belong in the trading profit and loss? Well, expenses and revenues belong there. So you'll see there in note 1 we have discount. Note 2 we have purchases. Part 3 there we have purchases again. Part 4 we have repairs. And part 5, we have equipment hire in the trading profit and loss. So we don't have any items on the credit side in this question, which is unusual. So remember that this net profit figure in the corrected or in the balance sheet, this is an incorrect balance sheet, so this is wrong. This figure 81,200 is wrong, so we're simply going to adjust them. Now remember, from our alert, when we have expenses, okay, they are debited. What do expenses do to my net profit figure? They would reduce my net profit figure. Now if an expense was on the credit side, that would be an expense reducing. So here that's expenses increasing, expenses would reduce on the credit side. So therefore, expenses reducing would also increase the net profit figure, okay? Revenues on the credit side would increase the net profit figure, but a revenue reducing, such as sales returns on the debit side, would decrease the net profit figure. So therefore, anything on the debit side is going to decrease the net profit figure. And anything on the credit side is going to increase the net profit figure. But we have nothing in this question to increase the net profit figure. So there's nothing happening there. All we have to do is enter all of these items, okay, into our statement of corrected net profit. And we are writing at the whole time the number that it's coming from and the label. You have to write that as well, okay? And you're taking all of them away, and that's going to give you a corrected net profit figure of €67,510. So that is part C, statement of corrected net profit. Part D then is we have to prepare a corrected balance sheet for 20 marks. Okay, so the rest of the items there are obviously then balance sheet items. So here we have bank, we have creditor, 2 amounts there, and we have cash. So that's all in number 1. In number 2, we have creditors. In number 3, we have capital on the credit side, 7,500, and we have bank, 22,500 on the credit side. Part 4, we have cash, €450 on the credit side, and creditors on the debit side, 450, and motor vehicles, 450 on the debit side there as well. Now, in the capital account, we have 5250 on the credit side, and we have equipment hire balance sheet, €1,050 on the debit side. Okay, so then we use them and we're going to fix the balance sheet. Now, using our alert diagram, all right, you know that when an asset increases, we debit. So therefore, when an asset decreases, we credit. So asset increases, debit, asset decrease, we credit. We also know that liabilities, when they increase, we credit. Therefore, when they decrease, we debit. All right, so starting this then, what we do first of all is we look at our balance sheet and we write it out very roughly, okay? We take the figures from here and we just write them beside the item here. So we're going to have adjustments in a lot of these, okay? So we can just do that over the side and then put in the total figure then. Now, the stock in current assets. This is from part B, so we are going to plus €6,600 there to the stock. So if you forget why we're doing that, you can go back and have a look at the suspense account and see why. And then the net profit figure, 67,510, and this came from part C when we corrected the net profit figure. Okay, so we're going to now look at the journalised entries and we're going to go down through them bit by bit, remembering that if it's an asset on the debit side we plus, if it's an asset on the credit side we minus, and if it's a liability on the credit side we plus, and if it's a liability on the debit side we minus. So first of all, bank 620 debit side. Now I want you to watch out and have a look here because the bank is actually a liability here. So bank is 31,000 bank overdraft. So 31,000. So €620 is going to be taken away from the overdraft because that's actually 620 coming into the bank. All right, so the next one we have creditor 300 debit side, 600 credit side. So 300 debit side. So creditor is a liability, so 300 is going to be minused and 660 is going to be plussed. So minus 300 plus 660. Then we have cash account credit 300. Okay, so cash is an asset. Assets on the credit side, we minus, so minus 300 there. Next, moving on to part 2, we have creditors, debit side, 13,500. So creditor is a liability, we minus 13,500. Then number 3, we have capital on the credit side, that is a liability, so we plus. So capital, 7,500 plus on the credit side there. Then we have bank on the credit side, so our bank is already a liability because it's down in creditors minus 1 year, so therefore this liability bank is going to be increased then, 22,500. Next, we're looking at the cash account. So cash is an asset. Cash on the credit side therefore is reducing this asset, so minus 450 euro there. Repairs, that we've already dealt with that, that's a trading profit and loss item. Then we have creditors on the debit side. Creditor is a liability. Liability on the debit side, we are going to minus 450 there. Then we have motor vehicles on the debit side. Motor vehicles are an asset. When an asset is on the debit side, we plus, so plus 450 euro there. Then we have capital account, 5250 on the credit side. So 5250 on the credit side, that is capital. 5250, we plus that to the capital account then. Then we have equipment hire in the balance sheet, 1050. So that is an asset, equipment hire prepaid. We don't already have that written in, so we're going to write that into the current assets. Equipment hire, 1050 there. Okay, so now all you've left to do is tot everything up. All right, so hopefully your total net assets then is going to be the same as your capital employed. So 823660 is your total net assets, and your capital employed is also 823660. So that is your balance sheet complete. So there's only 20 marks going for that, so you want to do that really quickly. Part E then, identify different types of errors that affect the balancing of a trial balance for 10 marks. So you can do any 3. All right, there only is 3 actually. It's not the ones that don't affect the trial balance. So there was 10 marks going for this, which is actually quite a lot of marks going for that. So the first one there could be entering one amount on the debit side of the ledger account and entering a different amount on the credit side of another ledger account. Number 2 is a mathematical error, so figures and additions. And number 3 there is posting only one side of the double entry.